Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, Atheists in Recovery land, and welcome to episode 66 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we are talking to Amazon best-selling author DJ Burr. We learn a little bit about his recovery journey today. We learn how he recovered through a very difficult childhood, and really in going through that childhood felt that God was not there for him. Felt that there was no way that God would be showing up for him because he had all of these really difficult moments throughout his childhood. And also the fact that, he knew that he was gay. And so we learn a little bit more about that. We learn about how a lot of what he had to go through and what he survived through growing up informed much of what he does today in his profession as a healer. We learn why he began to cry his eyes out when in a sex and love addiction group, thinking, now I have one more thing to work on besides codependency, being a teenage sexual assault survivor, and on and on. And we also talk about the reality that you are not a bad person just because you experienced trauma and you were engaged in this trauma landscape, but instead you accomplished so much. You're a survivor. And we talk more about what that is and how we can find hope amidst all of the pain and suffering. Okay, on to our guest, DJ Burr. DJ Burr is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in sexual addiction and codependency recovery. He's the best-selling author of I Just Wanted Love, Recovery of a Codependent, Sex, and Love Addict. The host of Journey On, Survivors Healing from Sexual Abuse and Assault, and he's a screenwriter on the verge of breaking into Hollywood. DJ is a survivor who is dedicated to thriving as a precious, perfectly imperfect human. He lives in the Seattle area with his husband and 2 kids. All right, guys, on to the show. DJ Burr, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm very excited that you're here to talk about a topic that needs to be talked about more, which is sexual addiction and love addiction and codependency and all that stuff.
That's me.
So I thought we'd start our conversation like I do all in conversations by just inquiring about your deepest roots from childhood.
Ooh, my deepest roots. They were tangled, burned, diseased, pretty chaotic. I was born in the South. I'm from Georgia originally. I live up in Seattle area now. But my family is very complex and set in their ways. And, it was challenging because even from a very young age, I had the notion that what I was experiencing, what I was observing was wrong. It didn't seem right. In fact, I wrote in my book that I wondered if I had been adopted, and I was waiting for my adopted parents, for my actual parents, my birth parents to come, to find me, to take me, because things just were so bad. I was like, it just doesn't seem right that things are so bad.
Yeah. What were some of the things that were so bad that you were hoping to be rescued from?
My stepfather was an alcoholic. And before he came along, it was me and my mom. And when she got married to him, there was a lot of abuse. And prior to even getting married to him, there was a lot of abuse. And even at their wedding, I think I was like 5, I ran out of the wedding. Like I just couldn't even stomach it. A 5-year-old running out of a wedding.
That's a statement.
Right. And, I was looked at like I was a problem. Well, fast forward all these years later, that is still the case. You can't do a reality check with people who are in denial. So that is my reality currently in my family system. So there was a lot of abuse there. It continued when my siblings came along, and I end up being like the protector of my siblings, their caregiver, their teacher. My mom worked 2 or 3 jobs. My stepdad was often drunk, and he and I would fight. They would fight. Cops were called often. My great-grandparents had one of those police scanners. And so whenever I call the cops on him, they would call on the house phone. What's going on?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And sometimes like my grandmother, my mom's mom, I would call her because she was like a safety net. Like I mostly grew up with my grandmother. Mm-hmm. Whenever like shit hit the fan at my house, I just packed a bag, usually like a garbage bag full of my stuff, and went to my grandmother's house. And on occasion, she would have to bring her gun with her.
Grandma had a gun.
Grandma had a gun. She had a gun because really bad things happened to her. And so she needed protection. And so if she felt like the situation was not going to be safe, she was going to be bringing it.
So she was your protector.
She was. Mm-hmm. Her, my grandmother, my great-grandparents, they were my primary caregivers outside of my mom. And I think, my mom maybe tried to do the best that she could do. But, she had 3 kids. She had 2 or 3 jobs at a time. She had her own issues. And until to this day, I still don't know all the things that kind of shaped who she is. I try my best to just let that go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think in order to move on, you have to make peace with that. Yeah.
Yeah, you do. I think some acceptance, right? Acceptance is a solution. And I've tried, and I continue to kind of turn that over to, for me, my higher power, for my mom and my dad. My biological dad was absent completely. Okay. He showed back up later, but even now he's absent.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned your higher power. What kind of a role did it play growing up? Did you have a spiritual background growing up?
I had a fearful experience of spirituality growing up. My family is Southern Baptist. We were, dragged to church, and I didn't hear anything that was welcoming. I also knew at a very young age that I was gay, and the things that I heard in the church were frightening. And so I resisted going. And very young, I just refused to go, didn't go. And so for me, I never thought that God would want to have anything to do with me, and that a higher power or God would not show up for me. And I had evidence to support that my belief that was true, right? This dysfunctional family system, the abuse, the physical, spiritual abuse, the mental abuse, the neglect, the abandonment. I'm like, where is God? It's not here. Right. And then as I got older, it just got worse, throw in sexual abuse, throw in addiction. And I was like, God's not here. Right. And so it wasn't until I got into recovery at age 30. So I'm 38. I'll be 38 next month. I'm going into my 8th year of recovery and sobriety in one of my programs. And so that has been my experience of spirituality. But if I really look back, my higher power was always there because I'm not dead, right?
Right.
I educated in a dysfunctional system, right? I got out. I have 2 degrees, right? I was able to salvage my life, but I did have to kind of crawl my way through it. Mm-hmm. And I recognize that I did not do that by myself. There's no way I could have done that by myself. No way.
Mm-hmm. Right. So even though you didn't trust that there was a higher power, looking back, you feel like there had to have been something that was helping you along,
Absolutely.
that knew that there were bigger things for you out there. Yeah.
Yep. All the things that I've gone through inform what I do today. And what I do today is I help others. And that's how I know that what I went through, even though it was hard and it was painful and it was sad. And sometimes I still even get sad and angry about it. It was necessary.
Yes. I definitely am writing this down because I want to come back to this. But
Okay.
I'm wondering if we could switch gears just a little bit, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your recovery journey.
Yeah, my recovery journey. Whew.
Uh-huh.
You know, I didn't know a thing about recovery before I left Georgia and I moved to Washington State. And I was in a really bad space. I was in a bad relationship and I was just broken. And I just kept engaging in dysfunctional behaviors until I was at the point where life just wasn't worth living anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was very scared and I was at the point of giving up. And I was encouraged to check out programs like Al-Anon. And I go to Al-Anon, I realize, oh, so my addict husband isn't really the issue. I need to be looking at my own stuff, right? He has his stuff, but I also have stuff. And then I heard about Codependence Anonymous. And then I went there and I was like, oh, this is all my stuff. This is all of my stuff right here. And I remember just sitting there crying my eyes out. And then it was like, I was like maybe in that for like 3 months before I found out about sex and love addiction. And I was like, oh, that's even more of my stuff. And that's when it started to get clear to me that I had been sexually assaulted and abused as a child, as a teenager. And it was in a 12-step meeting where that hit me. And it was like a ton of bricks. You know, I remember sitting in my car and I called my CODA sponsor and I was like, so I went to an SLAA meeting and I apparently have sex and love addiction because I answered 38 yeses out of 40 of the questions.
Right.
And I remember crying, like, now I got this to deal with, right? But it's really just been a part of the whole package, the whole entire time. How could it not?
Right.
Everything had been so distorted for me from the get-go. And so to be the target of a serial predator, not that surprising. I was vulnerable. And he knew it. He didn't even know everything about me, but he knew it.
He could see it or
he
sense
could see
it.
it or
Right.
sense it.
Right.
I don't know how that works with, but he could sense it. And he groomed me and he took advantage of me. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that's what had happened. And so now, as a person who's been sober from alcohol 8 years, and I'll be sober from my compulsive sexual behaviors in about 2 weeks, and that'll be 8 years, I've learned a lot about myself along the way. A lot. And I'm not bad. I'm not a bad person. I'm actually a good person who's just been to hell and back.
Right.
And survived.
Yeah, I love that you just said and survived, because I feel like, with people that have experienced trauma, they have this tendency to think that they're all bad, that their core being is bad. But, within that trauma landscape, you realize that there's so much good.
Yeah. It was my fourth step. I was giving my fourth step away in my fifth step. And one of the directives I had was to outline all the things that I was able to accomplish prior to getting sober. And the list was long. I wrote my first book prior to getting sober.
How old were you?
Well, I was in grad school.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was in grad school. I wrote my first book before I even graduated my program. I had graduated at 2 really difficult programs. I was successful in many different ways. I started at a LGBT alliance on my college campus.
Nice.
The list is long. And I was okay. Right.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that until I was reading that. And I just cried. That was the moment I cried after I think 6 hours of doing my 5th step. And I got to the end and I was like, here's the list of all the ways I took care of myself, even though I was sick. And that's what broke me.
Yeah.
Because I didn't see it.
I love that. Throughout this journey, when did you think that you knew you needed to seek help? Like when was that? Was there like 1 or 2 experiences where you thought, you know what, I can't do this alone. It's time.
Yeah, it was PrEP, which is, the pre-exposure prophylactic for HIV. So it was prior to that happening, right? I started engaging in unsafe sex practices. Mm-hmm. And that was against the rules that I had agreed to with my then partner. And so I was just taking this really dramatic, leap off the edge, right? There was no safety net at that time. And that went against my entire core of who I am, right? To put myself in that much risk. Even after I had done crazy shit in my past, I was like, I'm not doing that, right? And I did it. And I didn't care. I had given up. And I remember telling that to the therapist, and the therapist was like, you need to go to a meeting. And I was like, I am not going to a fucking meeting. I said it like that. What? I'm not an addict. I grew up with addicts. My stepdad was an addict. My mom's an addict, blah, 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 right? I don't have a problem.
I don't have a problem.
Nope, don't have a problem. But then I went. It's like, if you don't have a problem, then you shouldn't have a problem going. So I was like, oh, well, I'll check it out. Right. And then, like I said, little by little, I went from Al-Anon to Coda to, all the different programs and found my home. I found a safe place. I found serenity that I didn't know I deserved. But it was really my therapist, who I still work with today, all these years later, who got me into the rooms, and I resisted every week. Every week I went to the session with my therapist. He was like, you need to go to a meeting. And then when I started going to meetings, he was like, then you need to get a sponsor. I was like, what? What is that? Why would I get a sponsor? Why would they deal with me? And I remember meeting with my first sponsor, and I was like, why are you so nice to me, as I'm crying? You shouldn't be nice to me, And I was still acting out sexually, because I was in Coda first, and I was still acting out sexually, and I would tell him about it. And he was like, we need to talk about what self-care means. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I thought this was self-care, me acting out. It's okay. I have permission. It's okay. It fits in the rules of my relationship.
Right.
He's like, no. He's like, no, that's not self-care. I was like, well, you tell me what self-care is. Now, mind you, I had already been a therapist for many years. Many years. I was sending people to 12 steps before I got in it.
Okay.
So there had to have been there was this division.
There was a disconnect there. Yeah.
There was a total disconnect. Like, show up, be healthy and productive, and help people get the help that they need. But you're fine. You don't need help. That was the addict part of my brain just absolutely running the show.
Right. So you find this sponsor who is nice to you, and you start going to all these meetings, and you found the serenity. What do you think was so serene about being in these meetings and finding the sponsor? And
I didn't have to be perfect. That was thrown out the window. You don't have to be perfect. In fact, I have a tattoo on my arm that says progress, not perfection. And my whole life, I had thought that I had to be perfect because I was responsible for everybody and everything, or at least that's what I thought.
Right.
I thought it was my job to be perfect because hell would occur if, I didn't do everything that I was told, right? I would either get beaten or I would get something taken away from me, or I would lose love. I would lose affection. I would lose care. I would lose housing because that happened when I came out and said I was gay.
Really?
Yeah. I lost housing, had to find housing, So it was like, if I didn't do everything by the book, there was going to be a consequence. Well, I show up in the 12-step rooms and they're like, one day at a time, you have to take better care of yourself. You have to not ingest chemicals that are going to kill you, right? You have to set boundaries. You have to engage in loving kindness towards yourself. Really? That's it? That's where I was. I was like, oh, this is different. This is different. And this feels safe. And I think because the environment of the 12-step community feels so safe to me is the reason I haven't relapsed.
Yeah.
If I was still in an environment that was unhealthy, I probably would have relapsed. But as I got further along in my recovery, I removed myself from all of those unhealthy relationships. My marriage at the time, removed myself from that, removed myself from friendships, removed myself from family, all of those things. Now, yeah, over time I had to add back some family, but with a lot of boundaries.
Okay. And that's something that is taught to you within that codependency model. I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit about that. Like, why are boundaries so important if you're suffering with codependency? Or maybe what your definition is. Maybe you could start with what your definition is first.
Yes. My definition of codependency is a set of maladaptive coping strategies that were used at one time, typically in childhood, to protect yourself. And as we become adults, they're no longer functional, right? So maybe as a kid, I learned to avoid the conflict by hiding, right? Hiding under my pillow, under my bed, protecting myself from it, right? But as an adult, if I'm being beaten in my own house, hiding is not going to help me, right? And there was a time when my ex-husband beat me. And I thought that was going to be the last straw, and it wasn't. And I had to have a wake-up call, right? And I was like, it is not okay for someone to put their hands on me. And I had to say that. And I had to come in and say, this is what has to happen. Either you go to treatment or I leave. Right?
Yeah.
And he went to treatment. And what I didn't know then was that I was then without a job. I had no job. The caretaker role was discontinued.
Your job as caretaker was discontinued.
Yeah, my job was discontinued. He was in the care of somebody else, and then I completely spiraled out of control because I was lost. I didn't know what else to do. And that's when things escalated for me, the drinking, the reckless sexual behavior, all of those things, right? So I showed up to try to set a boundary, but because I didn't have an internal boundary to help myself, right, to guide me in the direction of care, I spiraled out of control. But once I was able to be informed about what healthy boundaries look like, both internal and external, I was able to get on the path of recovery and stay on it. Right? Because here's how I take care of myself. Because you know what? He didn't stay sober. He didn't stay in his program. He continued to do other shit. Right? But I stayed sober, and that's how our relationship fell apart. Because I was healthy and he was still acting out. And I was like, not working for me, buddy.
That is so interesting. In a lot of my research that I've done with individuals that are struggling with substance abuse, I found, because I did research with women only, in outpatient treatment settings. And it was the men that were keeping the women from getting treatment, because then that meant that they would have to go get help. And they were like, no, but it was the women that were forcing the men to go to treatment. It was just, so it happens in a lot of different ways, right?
It sure does. Absolutely. And I think in being a gay male, a Black gay male has some challenges along with it too. Right. I'm a Black gay male. I was in a relationship with a white male who had more privilege and power than I did, had more money than I did. Right. Even though we were married. Right. And he threw that around all the time. He controlled everything. If I questioned anything, I might have my card cut off. Right. My debit card. Like one time I couldn't get gas, when I was looking for an attorney. He already knew because he had hacked my email, right? Wow. And he had cut access. He had power and authority over me, and I gave it to him, not realizing that this power differential was there. I'd never really been taught that I needed to put myself in a position to take care of myself should the partner try to take control, right? Even though I saw it happening in my family of origin, I never was taught how to take care of myself, so I didn't end up in that position. So I ended up doing the exact same thing that happened to my mom.
Wow. Yeah.
And I told her that. I said, I married your ex-husband like twice already. And she's like, well, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. It happened and it needed to happen. And I'm grateful for the experiences because I learned a lot about myself.
Yeah. No, your journey is definitely a fascinating one. I feel like I could talk to you for a really long time, but I know we have to start wrapping up. I hate when that happens.
Yes.
So as you're kind of looking, you're coming up on the 8 years of being sober compulsive. Is that what you said?
Sober from sexually compulsive behavior.
Sober from sexually compulsive behavior. Can you tell the listeners what parts of yourself are different now, do you think, versus back then?
My creativity is front and center right now. As an author of multiple books, one being my memoir, I Just Want to Love, Recovery of a Codependent Sex and Love Addict. I wrote that 5 years ago, and people are still purchasing the book. People are still calling me. People are coming in to work with me because of the book. So that was life changing. It was a game changer for me. I am screenwriting now. I just published a dating workbook, an ebook. Yeah, you can get it on my website, djburr.com. And kind of using the things that I have gone through to help educate others, right? And so my creativity is front and center, whereas in my addiction, I was hidden, it was corrupted, I was prevented from engaging in it. But that is a primary focus for me. It's like, I got to be doing something creative or I'm not in a good place. Right? Because that is a part of me. That's how I give back the gift that has been given to me, right? And so I think that part is significantly different. And I think the other thing that's significantly different now is like I have a safe, loving, supportive family. I have my husband, I have my son, I have my daughter. We have friends who are sober. Most of our friends are sober or in 12-step programs. And so I have this family of choice, which is different. And I think without them, I'd be lost. So there's a lot of change, and it comes, I think, from these sources of good and health, and and because of that, I'm still sober, right? And I get to continue to help people. Yeah,
I love that. And you have a private practice, and you see people there, and you.
I do.
Yeah,
I specialize
you're able to glean from your
addiction.
experience. Yeah.
Yep. So my private practice primarily focus on sex addiction and codependency recovery. Of course, right?
Of course.
Of course. This is what I know, like the back of my hand. right? And so this is what I do 5 days a week. And so people come in to see me virtually because of COVID, and it works. It's great. I'm happy.
DJ, any final words for the Atheist in Recovery community as we kind of wrap up?
I think the final words I would say is find your path. Find your path where you feel safe, where you feel protected and supported, and walk it, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, that sounds great. How can people best find you and say hello on the social?
Yeah, the easiest way to find out more about me is djburr.com. You can find me on Twitter. I'm really active on Twitter with all my different communities at djburr1022. And you can also find me on Instagram, the DJ Burr.
Great. And I will put links to all of those on the show notes. Okay, DJ. Well, thank you again so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.